Corpus Christi is running out of water. Not slowly, not in a decade, now. The two reservoirs supplying 500,000 people stand at 8.4% combined capacity, the lowest since they were built. To picture what 8.4% looks like, take a standard swimming pool and drain it until only the water below the first rung of the ladder remains. A thin layer sitting on concrete. That is what is left. On the 14th of March 2026, the governor of Texas sent 4 words that confirmed what the numbers were already saying. Disaster is on the doorstep. Not a warning, a diagnosis. The city is the largest crude oil export hub in the United States. Its refineries produce 5% of America's gasoline and supply jet fuel to every major Texas airport. The same water keeping those refineries running is disappearing. So here is the question nobody in Austin, nobody in Washington, and apparently nobody at City Hall can answer. What happens to a country's energy supply when the city that feeds it runs out of water? Corpus Christi was never supposed to become one of the most important energy cities on Earth. 40 years ago, it was a modest Gulf Coast port. Salt air, pelicans, shrimping boats, a city that survived on fishing, tourism, and the modest oil production that had always dotted South Texas. Then came the shale revolution. The Permian Basin, 300 miles northwest, became the most productive oil patch on Earth, and all that crude needed somewhere to go. 3 pipelines, Epic, Cactus II, and Gray Oak, were built to carry it across Texas to the Gulf Coast. They chose Corpus Christi. Today, the port exports 2.3 million barrels every single day, roughly 60% of all American crude exports. 3rd largest crude export port on the planet, behind only Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia and Basra in Iraq. The refining capacity followed the oil. Valero processes 325,000 barrels per day. Flint Hills runs 350,000. CITGO adds 167,000. And in 2022, ExxonMobil and SABIC opened the Gulf Coast Growth Ventures facility, a plastics complex drawing up to 25 million gallons of water per day from the city system. By itself, that one plant consumes roughly as much municipal water as all 500,000 Corpus Christi residents combined. City officials did not just allow this growth, they courted it. In March 2017, City Manager Margie Rose sent a letter to ExxonMobil promising that Corpus Christi had sufficient water supplies to meet your needs. 6 days later, the city applied for state funding to merely study desalination feasibility. They were promising water they did not yet have to a plant that would need more water than the city had ever supplied. In 2018, to sweeten the deal for Steel Dynamics' new steel mill, an interim city manager promised yet another major water allocation, one that had not even been approved by city council. Every industrial commitment was a ceiling the water system had to grow through, and Corpus Christi had a structural problem nobody said out loud. It has no meaningful freshwater source of its own. It depends entirely on 2 inland reservoirs fed by rivers that run from rainfall that has been getting less reliable for 30 years. The water the city was giving away to refineries and plastics plants was water it was borrowing from a future it had not planned for. By 2019, the situation was clear enough that the city council voted unanimously to build a seawater desalination plant, 10 million gallons per day. Initial cost, $140 million. Operational by 2023, Mayor Joe McComb called it a pretty significant day in the life of our city. It did not turn out that way. Cost estimates climbed to $550 million by 2024. In October of that year, contractor Kiewit Infrastructure South won the build contract at $757 million, more than 5 times the original estimate. By July 2025, Kiewit had completed only 10% of the initial design work. The new total, $1.2 billion. From $140 million to $1.2 billion in 6 years, and not a single gallon of desalinated water ever produced. A retired chemical engineer named Encarnacion Serna had been watching since 2020. He had spent his career at Valero and Occidental Chemical working on exactly these kinds of industrial water systems. He reviewed the city's application and found what he described as flimsy assumptions, unrealistic estimates, and missing information. He wrote to city officials, He emailed repeatedly. He titled one message, "The Legacy of the Imbeciles." Nobody called back. Nobody wrote back. Nobody knocked on his door. "I've been trying since 2020 to let them know how catastrophic this is going to be," Cerna said in March 2026. "They've acted with a profound ignorance." The man who understood the engineering better than anyone in the room had been dismissed for 5 years running. He attended council meetings. He submitted written testimony. He contacted the mayor's office. Every warning went into the same place, a filing cabinet nobody opened until the reservoirs had already passed the point where his warnings could save anything. He was right about every number. The city was wrong about every deadline. And the gap between those two facts is measured now in gallons. The water department's own chief operating officer understood what was coming too. Drew Molly warned city manager Peter Zanoni in writing that canceling the desalination project would leave Corpus Christi without a fully permitted alternative. Molly resigned on the 20th of August 2025 and left for Houston. His replacement now presents the crisis projections to council projections that confirm everything Molly warned. On the 2nd of September 2025, the council voted 6-3 to kill the project. The meeting ran past 1 in the morning. 3 speakers were arrested by police during the proceedings. Mayor Paulette Guajardo delivered the epitaph for a decade of work and hundreds of millions of dollars, $50 million in the toilet. The city was left with $122 million in debt. No desalination plant, no permitted alternatives, and reservoirs that had already begun their final descent. The Texas Water Development Board had committed $750 million in below-market loans tied specifically to the project. When the city killed it, the TWDB refused to redirect those funds, calling such a reallocation unprecedented. The $750 million Abbott later accused the city of squandering was never a grant. It was a loan commitment that evaporated the moment the council voted no. The debt is permanent. The water is not. The water levels had been declining for years, but decline is slow, and slow things are easy to ignore when your job requires you to stand in front of cameras and explain that everything is fine. Lake Corpus Christi sat at 61% capacity in December 2023. By mid-2024, it had dropped below 30%. The city issued Stage 3 water restrictions. Outdoor irrigation was prohibited, car washes shut down, and then, briefly, the numbers improved. Modest rains in late 2024 nudged the reservoirs upward. Lake Corpus Christi climbed back toward 35%. City officials exhaled. Some council members cited it as vindication of their September vote. Local media covered the recovery with cautious relief. The crisis, they suggested, had been overstated. The projections were too pessimistic. The system had room to breathe. The improvement lasted 4 months. By January 2026, the rains had stopped again. The reservoirs went back into freefall. By the first week of March, Lake Corpus Christi dropped below 10% of capacity. On March 5, Zanoni stood before cameras at the lake's edge behind him. The exposed lake bed stretched hundreds of feet where open water had been a year before, and told television reporters, "I think we are going to get through this. This is no time to panic." Former water director James Dodson watched the press conference from his home in Fulton, Texas. He had overseen the most significant expansion of the Corpus Christi water system in the 1990s. He had watched this crisis build for years from the outside, long since finished with city employment. When reporters reached him the following day, his response required no elaboration. "It's the very worst scenario that I've ever seen. It's going to be an economic disaster." Then he added the sentence that cut through every reassurance Zanoni had offered. "They are crazy not to be panicking." By March 14, the governor's office had seen enough. Abbott's chief of staff wrote to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality that the reservoirs may be depleted as soon as May 2026. Abbott invoked emergency authority to suspend any permit requirement, standing between the city and emergency water projects. "The normal permitting process," he wrote, "takes several months, and Corpus Christi's demand for water will soon exceed available supplies." May. 8 weeks from the date of that letter. The crisis that officials spent years managing with press releases and procedural delays arrived as something different in the neighborhoods of Corpus Christi. It arrived as a water bill that kept climbing while the water kept running out, as a garden that died, as a peach tree that produced its last fruit while the reservoir dropped below the shoreline. Tamala Alejandro has lived in Corpus Christi for 15 years. She has 3 young children. She let her vegetable garden die this season, the peach tree too. She monitors every gallon used inside the house. Her water bill went up anyway. Stage 3 conservation surcharges are baked into the billing structure, and the city's emergency projects need to be paid for somehow. Put citizens and the people living here ahead of the corporations, Alejandro said. Why do we have to make these adjustments when it's not us using most of the water? That question contains the entire crisis in one sentence. City Manager Zanoni confirmed to CNN that just 12 companies consume approximately 55% of Corpus Christi's entire water supply, under the drought surcharge exemption fee, created in 2018 when the reservoirs were 2/3 full. Those industrial users can legally bypass drought restrictions for just $0.31 per 1,000 gallons. Residents who water their lawn during restricted hours face fines of $500 per day. That is not a policy misjudgment. That is the policy, operating exactly as designed. A citizen-led group called the Fair Water Amendment has gathered signatures for a November ballot measure to repeal the exemption, giving residents the direct vote on whether refineries can keep buying their way out of restrictions while their neighbors let their gardens die. Mana Lytle, age 70, lives in Hillcrest, the historic African-American neighborhood, sitting directly between the Flint Hills and Citigo refineries. Hillcrest was also the planned site for the $1.2 billion desalination plant killed in September. Residents had already filed civil rights complaints, arguing the city concentrated environmental burdens on their community. The Department of Justice declined to act. What the map shows is not subtle. The neighborhood that bears the most industrial exposure is also the neighborhood that was selected to host the infrastructure project designed to serve those same industries. The people breathing the refinery air were also the people whose streets were going to be torn up for the pipelines. Lytle's assessment carried the clarity of someone who has watched the same pattern for decades. The city needs to tell industry, we need to give our people water. They're getting water first, and we're second. Here is the part that makes Corpus Christi genuinely different from every other American city that has ever faced a water crisis. The math does not work in a way that policy alone can fix. When Cape Town came closest to a true day zero in 2018, residents cut showers, stopped watering lawns, let car washes close. Consumption fell by more than 50%. The city was saved. Robert Mace, water scientist at Texas State University, has described what is structurally different here. Cape Town's residents were cutting discretionary use. A refinery cannot do the equivalent. Water flows through cooling towers, not as a luxury, but as a physical necessity. The towers prevent temperatures from climbing to the point where equipment overheats and chemicals combust. You do not reduce that consumption by taking shorter showers. You reduce it by shutting down. Former Obama-era Assistant Energy Secretary Charles McConnell confirmed the logic plainly. You don't design a refinery or a chemical plant to start squeezing off your water supply. It's going to be a rather awkward dance. Then he added something that captures the full absurdity of what this city built over 2 decades. It's a surprise to me that none of those refineries down there have their own desalination plants. They're using municipal water, for Christ's sake. The physical limit is clear. The mathematical limit is just as brutal. The city needs 50 million gallons per day of new supply to survive 2026. Emergency groundwater wells currently produce 8.5 million gallons per day. The gap is 41.5 million gallons, and virtually every project on the emergency list requires a permit that does not yet exist, a legal hearing that has not been scheduled, or construction measured in months, not weeks. The Evangeline wells, the largest emergency project, designed for 24 million gallons per day, are mired in legal challenges. Neighboring water users filed formal protests, arguing the project would pump more than 4 times the total current production of all groundwater users in San Patricio County. No hearing date has been set. In a decision that speaks to how far past normal governance this has gone, the council voted to begin construction without permits. Council member Gil Hernandez acknowledged what that means with the most honest thing anyone at City Hall has said. "It's a little scary, but we're in a situation where we should be afraid right now." Abbott has threatened a state takeover. He has invoked emergency powers and pressured every agency in his reach to move faster. But even Abbott cannot make it rain. Even Abbott cannot compress a multi-year permitting process into 8 weeks. The deadline is not a political decision that can be overridden. The reservoirs do not negotiate. Real resources have been mobilized. Abbott lowered the Lake Texana curtailment threshold, buying roughly 6 additional weeks. The Western well field came online March 20, adding 4.5 million gallons per day. Emergency drilling permits are moving through the state system on accelerated timelines. The city has approved more than $400 million in construction contracts. All of it is real. All of it matters. But here is what all of it amounts to in the aggregate. Time, not a solution. The groundwater coming from the Nueces wells measures total dissolved solids as high as 3,300 parts per million, more than 6 times the federal drinking water standard of 500. The treatment plant is handling brackish water it was not designed for. Lake Texana, which supplies 76% of Corpus Christi's water, sits at 53% and is also declining. No major new supply arrives before late 2028 at the earliest. The May 2026 deadline does not care about 2028 timelines. What bought time runs out when time is gone. The reason Wall Street and national media started paying attention in March 2026 is not primarily because 500,000 Texans might lose their water. It is because of what else stops when the water stops. Flint Hills Resources delivers jet fuel from its Corpus Christi refineries through a pipeline system that has served Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the nation's 4th busiest, for more than 3 decades. It is the primary jet fuel supplier for Austin Bergstrom International Airport. If Flint Hills shuts down, there is no immediate replacement. Jet fuel cannot be trucked in at the volumes a major hub requires. The regional pipeline also moves gasoline and diesel north through San Antonio, Austin, Waco, and into the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, a supply chain 10 million people depend on. Corpus Christi's refining complex produces approximately 5% of America's total refined product output. Economist Ray Perryman was direct. The presence of refineries in the Corpus Christi area is shifting the severe water shortage from a local problem to an issue with significant potential economic ramifications for the state and nation. Investment projects worth up to $20 billion have already been deferred because companies cannot secure water guarantees from a utility that cannot make them. Here is what national media has almost entirely missed. Naval Air Station Corpus Christi is home to the United States Army's largest helicopter repair facility in the world, the Corpus Christi Army Depot, which services every Black Hawk and Apache in the American fleet. The base draws from the same municipal supply as the refineries and the residents. Between 2011 and 2017, the base lost 1.3 billion gallons through leaks in a water system built in the 1940s. The Department of Defense has never issued a public contingency statement about what happens to the depot if the municipal supply continues falling. That question has not entered any planning document. Here is what is real. Since Abbott invoked emergency authority, the Western well field is online. Emergency groundwater adds 8.5 million gallons per day. The curtailment threshold on Lake Texana has been lowered. Real actions by real people who have finally understood the numbers. None of it is fiction, and none of it closes the gap. Zanoni said something to CNN in March 2026 that cuts through every press release and every emergency order. If we get to the point where we have to declare a level 1 water emergency, there's no manual. There's no video, there's no, "this is how we did it the last time." There's a monumental task ahead of us to develop this. The city manager responsible for navigating the worst municipal water crisis in American history confirmed on the record that no plan exists for what comes next. For the first time, a major American city is approaching the point where the taps may go dry, and the people responsible for what happens after are still writing the instructions as the clock runs down. Former Port CEO Sean Strawbridge rendered his verdict with the tone of someone who stopped hoping anyone would listen years ago. Their lack of experience, their lack of knowledge, their lack of recognizing the risks. They've found themselves in quite a dire predicament as a result of those poor decisions. Time is up. The port is still exporting. The refineries are still running. The taps are still on. The two reservoirs hold 8.4%. The Army depot that repairs every Black Hawk helicopter in the American fleet is still operating on the same supply. And May is not a prediction anymore. It is a direction.